In this episode, I spoke with Garry Gormley, CEO of the Fab Group and an experienced contact center professional with 2 decades in the contact center industry. We talked about everything from what to consider when purchasing a workforce management solution to advice and strategies on how to manage supply and demand in your contact center, whether that's coming from an understaffed or an overstaffed position. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. It was a great episode. Thanks, Garry. Garry, absolute pleasure to have you on the WWFM show. I first came across Garry back in 2020 when he first launched the Contact Center Network. And by the way, if you have yet to engage with the Contact Center Network, it's a super insightful collection of bite-sized interactive webinars covering a ton of really interesting topics. And if you're in the contact center industry and you haven't heard of or haven't engaged with the Contact Center Network yet, it's a must listen, watch, and you'll pick up a ton of best practice ideas if you tune in. So highly recommended. Really great to have you on the show, Garry. Absolute pleasure.
Awesome. What an intro.
I know you're not all about the Contact Center Network, and you've got a ton of other, you seem to be launching new entrepreneurial concepts sort of every 6 to 9 months. I can't keep up. Could you just give a short intro to our listeners in terms of who you are, what you do, and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my main passion is contact centers. So I can bore the hind legs of a donkey talking about contact centers, as I was yesterday in a networking meeting that was at. But yeah, I am the owner-founder of Fab Solutions. And that is a contact center consultancy. So the ultimate aim of that is to help our customers, i.e. contact centers, help them deliver awesome customer experiences so that their customers, when they're picking up the phone, aren't heaving a big hefty sigh when they pick up the phone and they're listening to either hold music or staying on hold for a longer than necessary amount of time. So yeah, I set that up back in 2019. And then when COVID hit, I was twiddling my thumbs thinking, what we're going to do. So what better way to unify the contact center industry than to create a contact center network designed for the contact center from people in the contact center. So it's that kind of launched about April 2020. I think you were one of the very first guests to join, I think, if I remember correctly.
It was an honor.
Well, it's a privilege to have you. And then more recently, the entrepreneurial spirit kicked in again. And in 2022, February this year, I launched Fab Outsource Solutions. So that's as it says on the tin, it's an outsourced contact center specialized in inbound, outbound customer contact. And yeah, setting up one business wasn't enough, apparently. So now we are more rounded as a group. So I have to refer to it as the Fab Group now, because we've got more things that we want to pull into the mix around technology as well. So it will evolve even more, Doug. I am that kind of itchy feet. That must be what it is.
I think what I like about what you're doing is you talk first of all from a process and best practice perspective, and then you come in with the technology to enable it. And I think that's a really key message that is it's kind of unique in the market that I see anyway. And certainly the stuff that you do to engage with the industry is phenomenal. So always,
I mean, I've got a lot of respect for the industry. It's done a lot for me over the 20 plus years that I've been in it. So if I can give back to frontline agents, team leaders, operational managers in whose shoes I have been and know the challenges and issues that they face, if I can help in that way, then power to it.
Brilliant. So obviously this podcast is about workforce management. So we're going to zero in on that particular topic and pick your brains in terms of your thoughts around that. We always start with this particular question, and mainly because I spent probably 20 years trying to explain to people what workforce management is, and still today my mother doesn't know what workforce management is, and I've kind of given up on that one. But in your own words, how would you phrase workforce management? What does it mean to you?
You know what? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you've got workforce management, you've got workforce optimization, you've got workforce engagement management, and all those things. It's much of a muchness, really. Ultimately, I see workforce management is how can we get the right people doing the right things at the right time that delivers a positive outcome for the customer and for the business, so that it runs efficiently, it runs productively. And it's all designed to do what it should do, which is help improve customer contact and customer engagement, and make agents' lives easier at the heart of it. So whether you talk about WFM, WEM, WFO, I think it's all around how do we do what we do best with the people and the resource and the demand that we've got.
And that is a new, I would say it's a long overdue slant to workforce management, because when I first started 20 years ago in workforce management, it was pretty much all around just efficiency and nothing else. And forgetting about kind of the work-life balance that you can impact by the scheduling practices that you put in, or the types of breaks, and ensuring that they're getting the right learning and utilizing the time appropriately. That's where I think the technology vendors have picked up on the WEM, the workforce engagement, but it's long overdue. And I think if you're not already thinking about that, then for me, it actually you end up being less efficient, because if you push your people too hard, then they're going to slow down anyway, naturally, because they get tired, or they're going to go sick, or ultimately, even worse, they're going to leave, right? So
100%. And I always say that the most underused, and it's used in planning, but it's not as widely talked about in the operation. And I talk about that occupancy rate. Occupancy for me is a really good one in terms of, I call it the burnout factor. What is the burnout rate that you'll run into? And I think we talk about that in planning circles because we build it into the CAT plan, but we don't really cascade that into the frontline teams and the team leaders and the ops managers that say, right, here's what your current occupancy is, and here's how much you're sweating your assets. So people need a break.
Yeah, and I've even had, dare I say it, some operational managers that were seeking efficiency, and they were sort of running at the high 80% occupancy already, and going, how do we get more? And I'm going, I think,
don't really want more.
Yeah, not only is that probably going to hurt your engagement with your they're also going to suffer on the CX side of things as well. It's it's a balancing act for sure in workforce management.
100%.
Cool. So I kind of just want to pick your brains a little bit in terms of your technology expertise as well. I don't know how much exposure you've had to workforce management technology itself, but I think we talked about the fab solutions, and you're definitely going from strengths to strengths. So an interesting question that we always get around technology is, and it's specifically around workforce management, is what's the best way to deploy a workforce management solution that is going to maximize? We just touched upon some of it, but is there, when you're looking at a technology implementation, what's the sort of steps that you would advise people to go through?
You know what? I think these, I've seen contact centers that are running 50, 60 seats and they don't have workforce management tools in place. And I always feel for the person that's on the hook for the spreadsheet and the rota and the schedule, because it's not an easy thing to do on a manual basis. So when if I'm sitting down with a client and I'm looking at their operation, the first thing I generally tend to ask for is, show me your capacity plan. Because what that does is it tells me how close they are to their planning process. And I think that's the first piece that I'd say when you're looking to deploy technology to improve efficiency or improve productivity and how people are working. It's understanding, why do you want it? Why do you need it? What problems are you trying to solve for? So typically the problems that I often see are forecasts are shot to pieces.
You're putting it nicely.
The scheduling isn't optimized so that you've got patterns of people doing shifts that maybe aren't right for the forecast that you've got. So the demand isn't being managed. So I think when you look at the problems that you're trying to solve for, you can then go out to vendors and pitch those problems and then say, right, show me how your technology helps me fix these issues. And then you're buying something that is actually going to fix the problem that you're trying to solve for in the first place. Whereas the temptation is to go out and say, we need a workforce management system. What do you need it for?
Yeah.
Because I go into centers and they say, right, we've got a puzzle, for example. And they're like, yeah, but we don't put the forecast in it because we do it manually. And I'm like, well, what have you got the system for then? You've got to kind of think about what's the problem that you're trying to solve for, and then match the solution that you're getting to the problem, because you can buy loads of kit and it's got tons of bells and whistles to it. But if you're not going to use 50% of it, then you're probably paying over the odds for a license that you don't need. Whereas actually you could probably get a more basic or more fundamental package for a smaller price and then start to upgrade. So fix the problem that you're trying to solve for is probably the biggest tip when I say any kind of technology deployment, whether it be a workforce management system or a omni-channel contact center suite. Again, the amount of bells and whistles people buy and don't use, it's crazy, but you're paying for it. So that find technology that is going to fix the problem that you're trying to solve for.
It's that people and process first, and with technology as an enabler. Yeah, I so much agree with that. And I won't name the company, but one company that was involved in workforce management fairly early in my career, the customer service director bought it from her credit card, and we spent probably 3 years effectively doing what you just described there, which was putting in the forecast in, even doing the scheduling outside of the system, and then importing the schedules into the system because it didn't quite deliver on what we wanted to deliver. I mean, it wasn't until we decided, okay, and we're going to have to change everything that we do and the way we do it in order to fit the technology, that we got any benefit out of it.
You have to change everything to fit the technology rather than technology wrapping around you. And that's because people go into it thinking or not thinking about the problem that they're trying to solve for, and then they get sold a kipper, and it's like, all right, so how do we do that now? So we got to do this to do this, and then we've got to import that, and then we've got to manipulate it here, put it in this format to upload it. I'm like, you've just created a whole new set of processes, the system you're trying to deliver on. But
absolutely, yeah. So another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I think we just touched upon it a little bit, is around striking that balance between supply and demand in a contact center. So I starting with a sort of general question: if a business is short of employees to achieve their business objectives, what strategies have you seen or have deployed or witnessed being deployed in your career so far that have been quite effective?
You know what, I can talk to the nth degree about this because I've done it in contact center life when I was in PAYE land, and I help contact centers fix some of those challenges. And I think the core fundamentals need to be there, and we've talked about this already, is to say, right, if your planning process isn't right, start with the planning process. Before you start to try and build your supply and your demand, you have to have a really clear and robust planning process. And I always talk about in different speaking events, talk about operational excellence plus employee experience equals great customer outcomes, great customer experience. And that operational excellence piece is built on the foundations of how well you plan. So for me, I think it goes right back to, if you've got a supply issue or a demand issue, what is the issue? What are the root causes of either of those? If it's high demand, where is that demand coming from? And going right back to the start to say, right, is it call demand, email demand? Is it web chat demand? And then what are we doing to look at those areas and look at the root cause of some of that demand? Because if we can switch some of it off, then your supply issue becomes less of a problem. Alternatively, if we do something with the demand and it deflects it to a different channel, you're just creating a bottleneck in a different area. So I did some analysis recently with a business, and we were looking at the call dispositions for each of their different customer outcomes. And what was interesting is a lot of the demand is being driven by failure. So because of an online system not working, people are having to call in. So actually, if we can switch off that 10% of call demand about that saves us X amount of hours a month on demand. So actually the supply that we're saying we've not got enough of suddenly becomes more abundant because you've switched off some demand. So you've got to be really analytical, I'd say, at the start point and say, right, what is causing the problem. If it's a supply issue, is it that you've just not got enough people and fundamentally you are under-resourced, or is it that those people are doing the wrong thing at the wrong time?
Yeah.
So again, and that's where good operational management kicks in, is to say, right, if you've got the luxury of having real-time analysts, what are they doing? What observations are they making? What trends are they picking up? Why are people deviating from what's scheduled? Is it an adherence problem? Is it a conformance issue? And understanding the behaviors that are happening in the contact center to say, right, is it a behavioral issue where we just need to strengthen operational management? Or is it a more fundamental issue where we just simply don't have enough demand or enough resource for the demand that we've got? And then it goes back to, right, okay, so is the problem a demand issue? So it kind of goes in a bit of a infinity loop. But the key thing that I see where people don't pay enough attention is in planning their shrinkage. So they woefully underestimate how much shrinkage they've actually got in the center. Or they, even worse, they'll say, right, our shrinkage is this. But it's not. It's not. That's what you're planning to.
Where did that
but
number
the
come
reality
from?
of it is,
Yeah.
it's not. Where is that number coming from? It's like, well, we allocate this much for training and development. Okay, so are you doing that much for training and development? And actually, some people they flatline their shrinkage and say, right, we've got this much for holidays every single month of the year. I'm like, but surely your holiday allocation will change in July and August, or maybe at Christmas. I'm like, no, just flatline it. I'm like, okay, so you're creating yourself a problem already because you're going to be out of kilter with that supply. So it goes back to the basics, I think, sometimes, and just saying, right, how do we plan the capacity plan, and then understanding from that, have we got enough capacity? And actually, sometimes we give ourselves a bit of a hard time and say, right, we want an 80% service level, or we want a 90% service level in X amount of seconds. The reality of it is, since COVID these days, customers are prepared to wait longer. I'm not suggesting that you go and say, right, we're going to get 80% of calls answered in 10 minutes, but give yourself a little bit of wiggle room and don't give yourself as much of a hard time about answering calls in 20 seconds, because that's a kind of a bit of an antiquated service level these days. Unless it's built into your contract, why would you break your back trying to deliver a service level of that exceptional service? But business requirement, I suppose.
It's so true, and that shrinkage management is something that I even forget at times as well, where you end up just going not actually measuring whether you're using it. And sometimes as well, when you're allocating X amount of, say, to training and coaching, and you're not using it, that's almost like a cardinal sin, because you're not investing back into your people. And
and it's always the first thing to go. But actually, if you don't train your people, the call handling time is never going to get any better. People's speed to competence is not going to improve. They'll still take longer, and then they leave. So then your attrition goes through the roof. So it's for me, it's the last thing that should be removed. But unfortunately, it usually is the first thing to get pulled.
And I liked your point around service level. I sometimes think some of these can be a little bit arbitrary. I use the dentist chair analogy a little bit, in terms of, well, when you're sitting in a dentist chair, it feels a lot longer than it is in reality, and that's just basically saying that time is perceived. So from a customer perspective, if you've got a greater service target of 80% within 20 seconds, let's say, and you're delivering 0% against that, but actually answering all of your calls within 21 seconds, from a customer point of view, they're probably not noticing that one extra second. And they might not even be noticing.
Nobody sat there timing it. It's not like the customer sat there with a stopwatch.
And we do get a bit, certainly in the workforce management community, we do get sometimes a bit fixated about meeting that service level target at the expense of everything else. And I think that's a really good point that you make.
There's a phrase that I always quote. I think it's a Peter Drucker quote. It's what gets measured gets managed. I think sometimes we obsess about the number. Whereas what I say is actually forget service level. What's your average speed of answer? That's probably a better metric. Or what's your abandonment rate? That's a more fundamental metric to get hung up on. Because if your average speed of answer is 4 or 5 minutes, that's a problem. If it's 21 seconds, that's not a problem. But your service level might say that you need 20 seconds. So it's all relative, isn't it? And it's that you said the word before. It's all customer perception. Customers these days, from surveys that I've done, they're willing to wait 3 to 5 minutes, at least. And there is an expectation that I'm going to have to wait. Aside from the message that still exists on your phone line saying that due to COVID, we've got long wait times. I'm like, happened a while ago, guys. You might want to change that. But people prefer to wait a little bit longer now. And I think these the more interesting you can make your IVR and your hold music and your music on hold experience, I think again that just creates a distraction, and that's all IVRs that are there for, in my view, is to distract the customer from waiting. And I think there's creative ways to do that. And I worked with a client recently where we said, right, what are the FAQs that you tend to get on your website? How clearly are they signposted on your website? And actually, are there some of the ones that might be on your website that might be useful to put on hold? I mean, you might get some positive abandonment rate from that, in that people hear it and then leave, and it kind of skews the result. But then you just got to do the analysis there. So at what point did they drop off? Did they hear something about X that they were looking for? So again, if we get hung up on abandonment rates, sometimes that can have a negative behavioral consequence, I suppose. But
it's dead complicated, isn't it? But it's a really good point, and it's something again we always tend to forget about. Is like, you know, in terms of that that queuing experience, and yeah, I definitely relate to some queuing experiences where you've just got this horrific hold music that just driving you crazy, or the one where it goes, I'm sorry, you're waiting, or something like this. We'll get to you soon, about 100 times.
You're not sorry, because otherwise you'd have answered the phone 20 minutes ago. And I think I was on hold to an energy supplier who shall remain nameless, but they played the same 5 songs 50 times. It felt like 50 times. I'm like, I can tell you what's next. Like, I felt like a radio DJ saying, next coming up is Taylor Swift with Shake It Off. Like, tell me now.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, on the flip side, and I think, and I fear a little bit that this may become quite relevant in the coming months. Obviously, we've been through, well, for some businesses, it's been the pandemic, and the was really very good for them, and they're actually now probably in a position where they're looking at the forthcoming, let's call it this, global recession, and I've seen scaling back all the while at the moment. Whereas others maybe we have a little bit more of a stable business, but I think everyone's kind of starting to turn their eyes to what does it look like going forward. So if a business does end up with too many employees, what's the effective strategy for creating, for dealing with that situation? It's a difficult one because ultimately it's people's jobs at stake, but it is another side of workforce management that's very relevant.
Yeah, and you know what? I've seen already on LinkedIn a number of redundancy announcements, and I think they're always before it gets to that point. I think all of the decisions about how we redeploy and how we can shrink down people's hours, maybe, I think all those conversations have been had. But I think the key ones for people thinking about, we have a surplus of resource, surplus of people. It's thinking about, is there a different approach to contracts that we can change? So thinking about demand and where that demand's coming through. I spoke to one client recently who's got more seasonal peaks, and we were talking about changing contracts to things like annualized hours, so that we don't need you now, but we'll need you at this point. So moving people towards that. I think these condensing people's time down and having a more flexible approach to contracts is probably the go-to with that. Say, right, actually, we don't need you 5 days, but we could do 4 days or 3 days, and does that work? I think there's an opportunity to look outside of your own center as well. I think sometimes we get bogged down with, this is my department, this is how much resource I need to run this department efficiently, but actually there's the opportunity to redeploy people to different areas of the business for a period of time or permanently, if job opportunities and rules and contracts allow it, is to say, right, we'll multi-skill you on different areas, so you can do a bit of back office, so you can do a bit of front office. And I think it's just trying to be as creative as possible with the shifts and with the profiles and the schedules that you've got to say, right, how do we either condense hours and condense time down so that we've not got as much, but we're not laying people off, or do we use it in a different way? And if you're in a fortunate position to have too much resource, but you don't need to make them redundant, or you don't need to condense hours, you've got the age-old thing. Let's look at holidays. Let's look at sabbaticals. Let's look at training and development and workshops and all the stuff that you can do productively and proactively to say, right, we know that we've got a spare amount of resource, so let's put everybody who needs it in training. Let's upskill them on a new product or a new service, and use that time proactively to develop and educate and get the value. And actually, if they want to go and shadow somebody in a different department for a week and you've got the capacity to be able to do that, go and use that as a career pathway. It's not always about reducing hours or sending people on holiday. It's using that resource internally to upskill in different areas, I think.
Yeah, it's I think sometimes some businesses are too quick to go straight to the layoff button, and forgetting about the time invested in bringing people up to competency, that valuable resource that you may well need in a couple of months. And I think you have to be very, very certain that what you're doing is
it's that naivety as well, is to say it costs. I mean, you've probably seen more recent stats than I have, but the cost of hiring and the cost of people leaving, it costs around 11 grand an employee to recruit. So actually, if you think, right, we're going to save it here, but actually when you then come to recruit them again, because your demand's gone back up and you're growing again, you're building in all that recruitment cost, you're building all that lost efficiency and competency as they start to gain skills and knowledge. So you're losing it further down the track. So I suppose it's short-term pain for long-term gain, but it's just thinking, I suppose, a little bit more broadly, is this a slump that we're going to grow from? And in which case, do we just take the hit and we take the cost of resource on the P&L for future gains in the P&L in terms of efficiency, or do we actually need to lay people off?
Yeah,
I think hopefully a lot of those conversations have already been had before it gets to that point. But I think particularly maybe in smaller centres, it's a quick reaction to say, right, okay, we don't need as many people, or budget says you only now need this. I think that's when you start to operate your centre based on a budget, that's where I start getting nervous, because it means you make different. I mean, you obviously have to have a budget, but when you're using that budget to fuel major decisions, rather than thinking a bit more practically, that's where it gets a little bit nervous for me.
And that's fundamentally the one of the biggest value streams for workforce management. So when you're peering at 1, maybe 2, 3, even some plans seem to go out to 5 years, and they're bottom up, so they're not based upon a top-down budget number. They're based upon, this is what you need in order to deal with your customer demand. The big value there is that you can look, okay, it's not going to be hugely accurate 3 years out, but it'll give you a picture of the economic turns, and you can make a decision that, like you say, is more effective for the long term than just some short-term decision, because like you say, the budget says we have to.
And where I see some shortfalls sometimes is that disconnect between business wants to grow, we want to generate more sales. Okay, right. So we want to generate 10% more sales than we did last year. Okay, so what does that mean from a marketing perspective? Right, we're going to get X amount more leads. So we'll build in that. We'll expect marketing. We'll expect you to deliver more leads. Sales, we expect you to deliver more sales. Nobody, or sometimes, probably a bit broad sweet, but nobody then sort of like makes the connection to say, right, if we're going to generate X more sales, that means X more sales calls. And actually, if we're going to generate more leads and we want this many sales, we're going to have more failed sales opportunities than we have actual sales. So the conversion rate that we apply, so the number of calls that you're actually going to handle is going to be X, because marketing are going to do a great job and they're going to drive a load of leads in. But it's then saying, right, that then comes at an FTE cost. So how do we build that into the budget? And then what we've then got is now we've got more customers. So those customers are actually going to want to speak to us at some point to be serviced or to be retained. So that then has a knock-on effect in terms of the volume of FTE that you're going to need in your service teams. And it's playing it all through, which I think sometimes gets missed. Say, right, great, we want 10% growth. Let's go get 10% growth. But actually 10% growth means or might be equivalent to a 10% uplift in FTE. Whereas actually most people say, right, we want 10% growth, want to do it on 10% less FTE. How do you do?
Yeah. Are you living in dreamland? I had a similar kind of experience again earlier in my career, thankfully, and I've not had it since. But I had a call from marketing. So Doug, I just don't understand why our marketing campaign is falling off the cliff. Is there any insights you can give me? And I said, yeah, the 40% abandon rate that we've currently got, because you didn't tell us about the marketing plan. That's probably somewhat to do with the fact that, yeah, the customers are coming through, but they're not converting because they're not getting through to us. So there's lessons there for learn, I think, for sure, and that's why I always evangelize that bottom up plan.
Still happens. I mean, I still have conversations with people like, marketing sent this out and didn't tell us. I'm like, did you include them in your planning meeting? No. So it's
also
not
true. Also true. Yeah. It goes both ways. That's fair. Yeah. And on the customer service side of things, I think I see two kind of schools of thought. So some organizations will look at the customer service as a cost. Others will look at it as a defensibility pillar, because they're the ones that ultimately are upholding your brands to customers day in, day out. And I think that if you're looking at that growth flywheel, they all syncs in together. If you're looking for repeat business or these sorts of things, then customers remember that engagement they have with the customer. So I guess be careful with your CS resource as well, because that also plays quite heavily into your growth. And
I always say, I look at what's your cost per sale, what's your cost per customer, because actually if you know those two numbers, you can then say, right, every customer that we lose, it's going to cost us X, and then it's going to cost us X amount to acquire it. So having a close eye on that retention number and thinking about how you either proactively contact those customers. So what's your loyalty plan? How do you segment your customer base? How do you know which customers are giving you X amount of profit, and maybe need an extra bit of TLC to make sure you retain them? And then piecing that in to say your outbound calls that you're going to need to do in your customer service team are X. You've also got your inbound demand that you need to plan for. Put those two numbers together, gives you your actual resource requirement, rather than people saying, oh, we're just an inbound team, so you don't do any outbound calls at all. No. And then when you go and look at the outbound report, you've got a ton of outbound calls that are either linked to calls that you're making for complaints, calls that you're making as callbacks or follow-ups, but you don't do any outbound calls.
Yeah, it's very true. I've come across that as well. Okay, want to just shift gears for the last section, and I know you've been in and around workforce management. Clearly, you've got a good grasp of it from what you've just shared. Like you, if it's possible to share one particular story that you think our audience would really value, and focus on any mistakes or lessons learned, things that you think would be good for people to avoid. Hoping you've got a story here, Garry. I'm pretty sure you will.
Yeah. This is plenty. I've done it wrong enough times as well to learn.
That's my favourite saying. Yeah, if you want mistakes, I'm the person to come to. Yeah, I've done them all.
Yeah. You know what? One particularly challenging area springs to mind. I used to manage a travel insurance team, and the whole business went through a big regulatory change, and it went from a very transactional sale to a more demands and needs and non-advised regulatory statements that you had to read. And I think the bit that we probably missed the trick on that absolutely crippled the operation was average handling time. Saying, right, actually, we now need to add lots more into the script, add lots more product detail into it. And it literally floored the operation because it was only a relatively small team. So small changes in handling time, when it's a small team anyway, have a massive effect. And I think I took a lot of learns from that particular scenario, because it came back to all the things that we've talked about there. Is the basic components need to be met in order for whether it's a small team or a large scale team, the basic components need to be met in order for that team to do well. So I think when you're driving change in projects, and I think this is really key in a lot of contact centers because they're constantly going through change. When you're driving initiatives and change programs, it's really key that you join up the dots on the impacts of those change programs to things like handling time, processes, because what I learned from that is we went from 90% plus service levels, probably over resourced, to like single digits on some days. So I'm like, oh God, what have we missed here? And it literally, it floored the operation. So I think it's then thinking, going right back to it, to the start point, and saying, right, what demand have we got? What supply have we now got? How has that demand changed in terms of its profile, in terms of the average handling time, and how does that impact on the staffing ratio now? So actually going right back to the start point, saying, right, you now need X amount more FTE in order to deliver the service levels that you've got. Because what was happening at the time is agents were just burning out. So they're just taking call after call after call after call after call. And we talked about the occupancy rate. That was like sky high. And it was a case of having to go cap in hand and say, right, we've underestimated the budget based on this. So we actually now need an extra 2 FTE at least to handle the demand at a reasonable service level. And that gives us a fighting chance. But thinking about then the whole piece that we talked about around upskilling and cross-skilling, the way that we've managed that, we were trying to beg, borrow and steal resource from other areas that had skills in those areas to either support it with overtime or support it as downtime in certain areas. So it was trying to get creative with that solution, and managing it as best as you possibly could whilst the handling times were as they were. And there was an expectation that they might come down as agents get more confident with the script and more clear on the process. But the reality of it was going nowhere. It was now your new handling time that you needed to build your cap plan on. And that was a big lesson learned for that one, because it was like, actually, we probably should have anticipated that and built contingency for it. But it's how you work your way out of that situation and plan for it as best as you possibly can, and then build the new plan based on the new known variables.
I like as well the fact that you've not in any of that story talked about needing to get the HT down. But the regulatory changes changed the process, so therefore that was the new HT. And I think sort of looping it back to what you were saying right at the start, it's so easy to be led by a number. So this is the HT. I think I've got a couple of horror stories in terms of going into a contact center once and seeing a contact center manager do that limbo where you're going underneath the bar, and they had a HT prize of how low can you go, and I was like, wow, okay, this somehow the message has got masked here. The HT is a management figure. It's one that's essential for workforce management, but you shouldn't be led by enforcing that number on an agent. Because
and I get nervous when I start seeing incentives around average handling time, because and what miraculously happens when you run an incentive on average handling times, everybody's handling time goes lower. Strangely. But then when you start to look at quality scores, and when you start looking at short calls that have been disconnected, and the average handling time for particular types of calls that might be a bit more difficult or more challenging calls, suddenly they get shorter. Why? Because people have just cut the call, or they've stopped offering all the extra niceties that they would have done on a call, that add to your customer service skills, that add to your NPS, which add to your customer effort scores, all those kind of things, because we've shifted the focus on something that is just going to go back up in 2 months' time when the incentive stops. So you've got to be really, I call it what are the unintended consequences of any reward scheme? And when you start running incentives on things like AHT, or when you start making severe cuts to pieces of script, you've got to think about the downstream impact of, why do we say that in the first place? Why is that important that we tell customers that at that point? And an organization that I worked with, it went crazy on lean, and saying, right, why do we say that there when we say it a number of times down the line in other departments? Like, well, we have to say it there. Oh no, let's take it out. And then the downstream impact of that is customers aren't clear on what they've bought. Customers don't know what their process is to engage with you when they want to claim or something like that. So it becomes an important part that might be small there, but has a more significant meaning at a different point in the journey. So you've just got to be really careful with AHT. I think it's a tricky one to balance, but done well, it can have a positive impact. Done badly, it can go really wrong.
The only really effective way that I've found to impact HD, and sometimes actually ends up increasing it. But it is through outlier management. So looking at your agents that are taking the longest, looking at your agents that are taking the shortest. You often find actually those agents that the short ones are actually causing customer experience problems anyway. So you'll probably move them up. But the idea being that you condense the HT to as close to standard deviations as you can. And those that are on the long ones, often they need help. They need maybe extra coaching, or they need help just generally. So that's a bit of a marathon, but at least then you've got that nice balance in terms of you eking out, say, process problems, you eking out educational problems, and you're helping those that also maybe on the lower end of the HT that are probably also driving repeat contacts as a result of not dealing or resolving the customer's issue in the first place.
Yeah, and you've got to look at the whole of the operation. So we get hung up on what's happening in our part of the world, but quite often when I break down average handling time, I'm like, right, let's look at hold. Who are we on hold to? How long are we on hold to? Have you got a process for how long somebody spends on hold to another department, and what the impact is on that customer? So, well, we have to stay on hold because we've got a first call contact resolution rate. So if I don't stay on hold, I can't go back to the customer because the customer's going to ring back. I'm like, it would probably be easier for you to tell the customer you're going to call them back, save the time, get the answer. You might not have hit first contact resolution for that, but you've just saved a whole load of efficiency, and you've saved the customer having to hold for so long at the same time. So I'm sure they would appreciate a call back rather than having to hold for 10 minutes.
Garry, I could talk to you all day, but otherwise, I think this podcast would probably end up being hours and hours long. So we'll finish it there. But thank you so much for willing to come on today. Some really super insightful insights, and very much appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to WFM. This podcast is made and produced by André Leitão, Bilge Hentelun, Doug Carsteton, Gonçalo Gomes, and Kim Paz. If you like this show, don't forget to share it with your friends and colleagues. Visit our website, wwfm.com, to find more exclusive interviews and WFM content. See you next time. All rights reserved.